Chapter 23. Participles. Chapter 23 covers the following: the formation, translation, and use of participles in Latin, and the nature of relative time. At the end of the lesson, we'll review the vocabulary which you should memorize in this chapter. There are 4 important rules to remember in Chapter 23. Rule 1. Latin has 4 participles: the present active, the future active, the perfect passive, and the future passive. It lacks, however, a present passive participle, that is, being verbed, and a perfect active participle, having verbed. Rule 2. The perfect passive, future active, and future passive participles belong to first, second declension. The present active participle belongs to third declension. Rule 3. The verb esse has only a future active participle, futurus. It lacks both the present active and all passive participles. Rule 4. Participles show relative time. What are participles? At heart, participles are verbs which have been turned into adjectives. Thus, technically, participles are verbal adjectives. The first part of the word, parti, means part. The second part, kip or sip, means take, indicating that participles partake or share in the characteristics of both verbs and adjectives. In other words, the base of a participle is verbal, giving it some of the qualities of a verb. For instance, tense. It can indicate when the action is happening, now or then or later, that is, present, past, or future. Conjugation. What thematic vowel will be used? For instance, A in first conjugation, E in second, and so on. Voice. Whether the word it's attached to is acting or being acted upon, that is, active or passive. And if it can express voice, then it must also be able to express expectation. In other words, will the participle be followed by a direct object? If so, it must be active. Or an agent? If so, it must be passive. Participles can also be followed by anything the verb naturally expects: indirect objects, complementary infinitives, ablatives of separation, and the like. That's the base of participles. Their endings are totally different. They're not verbal, but adjectival. That is, they contain the type of information adjectives do: case, number, and gender, allowing them to agree with nouns, or, as often happens, serve as substantives. But like adjectives, participles cannot stand alone and make sense. Well, actually, they can and often do in the works of ancient authors, but in this class we're going to pretend they can't. So, participles cannot serve as the basis of full sentences, the way finite verbs do. Instead, they create phrases, that is, dependent forms which must be embedded inside a larger thought that has a full finite verb. Before embarking on the formation and use of Latin participles, let's look at a few examples of participles in English, beginning with present tense participles. For example, listening, as in, listening carefully, students can learn much from their teachers. Here, the first part of the participle, listen, comes from a verb. In its present tense form, the students are listening and learning at the same time, now. While the second part of the participle, ing is an English participle ending, turns the verb listen into an adjective agreeing with students. In other words, in the same way an adjective like smart or attentive could have been attached to students, listening carefully, smart and attentive students can learn much from their teachers. Listening modifies students. It tells you what kind of students they are. Notice that participles like listening convey not only tense, in this instance present tense, but also voice and expectation. For instance, giving Latin their full attention, most students get A's. Here, Giving is active. The students are doing the giving. They're not being given. And by being active, giving naturally expects what most active voice verb forms take, a direct object. In this instance, their full attention. And because the meaning of the verb give expects an indirect object, you give something to someone, the participle has an indirect object. Here, Latin. In other words, to Latin. Besides being active voice, participles can also be passive voice, as in, being instructed by a Latin teacher, students understand English better. As before, ing indicates that the form is a participle, but when it's expressed with be plus the ed form of the verb, it becomes passive, which means it expects an agent, by a Latin teacher. In addition to voice, participles can change tense. An English perfect active participle, such as having learned good grammar, students often go on to great success in life. The ing in the verb form having learned shows it's a participle, and the have plus ed shows it's past tense. The lack of any form of the verb to be is a sign the participle is not passive but active, and thus it expects a direct object. Here, good grammar. Just like present participles, perfect participles can be passive, as in, having been guided by the best teachers, students often experience joy and fame. The ing shows it's a participle. Have plus ed shows it's past tense, that is perfect. And been shows it's passive, which of course sets up the expectation of an agent by the best teachers. Besides present and past, participles can be future tense as well, though they're not as simple to form because the normal future tense marker in English will cannot be used with participles. Where we can add having to a verb form to create a perfect participle, like having done it, we can't do the same with will. Willing do it? Instead, we have to say about to do it, or going to do it. In the next chapter, we'll learn this is called a periphrastic construction, meaning it's a long way of saying a simple thing. That is, the construction requires more words than necessary. Here's an example of a future active participle construction in English. The students, about to confront some very difficult grammar, resolved to study like never before. The about to tense marker indicates that the action of the verb confront will take place in the future, and the lack of a verb to be shows that the participle is active and will expect a direct object. Here's some very difficult grammar. Future participles can be passive as well. For instance, the students, about to be confronted by some very difficult grammar, resolved to study like never before. About to shows that the participle is future, and be shows that it's passive, and, like passive forms, expects an agent by some very difficult grammar. Here are all those participles, active and passive, present, perfect, and future, in chart form. Note the use of ing in the active forms, verbing, having, verbed, going to verb. The passive forms use instead a form of be plus ed, being verbed, having been verbed, going to be verbed. Now let's talk about Latin participles. Here are the simple formulas for those participles: verbing, being verbed, and so on. Of these 6 participles, the Romans had only 4. The present passive and perfect active are missing, which, when you're memorizing these forms, is nice. 1/3 off is a discount most student buyers can't resist. But take my word for it, it's not nice in practice, since the absence of these forms forced the Romans into some mighty odd workarounds, as we'll see in the next few chapters. You'll come to want them, but wanting isn't getting, so tough luck. The present active participle is formed in Latin by taking the present base of a verb plus the thematic vowel appropriate to that verb's conjugation, and adding the adjectival ending ns, ntis, and so on, following third declension. Remember that, even though participles come from verbs, they're adjectives fundamentally. For example, the present active participle of amo, first conjugation, is amans, amantis, and so on. We'll talk about the translation of these forms in a second. No present passive participle in Latin or perfect active participle, so on to the perfect passive participle, which you've already learned. It's the fourth principal part of the verb. In the case of amo again, amatus Take that same base, add UR between the perfect passive verb base and the ending, and you have the future active participle. Its distinctive urus ending follows first-second declension, rendering forms like amaturus Funny that a future form uses the perfect passive base, but that's the way it is. Don't let that trip you up. No such problem with the future passive participle. It uses the present verb base plus nd, not nt, be careful, plus first-second declension endings, producing forms like amandus, Okay, that's complicated. Let's make it simpler. This is the core of what you need to know. These four markers, participle signs you might call them. nt, present active, equals ing. ts, perfect passive, equals having been. Tur or sur, future active, equals about to or going to. And nd, future passive, equals about or going to be. Notice that two of the participles, the present active and future passive, use the present active verb base, and two use the perfect passive base, the perfect passive and future active, which means that thematic vowels are significant for the present active participle and the future passive. A will be used in first conjugation, E in second and third, and IE in third IO and fourth. Notice also that only one of the participles employs third declension endings, the present active. All the others use first-second declension endings. So, what is the dative singular ending for the present active participle of amo? The ending is I, so the correct answer is amanti. What about the ablative singular of the same form? Will the ending be I or E? The answer is both. When a participle like amans is used as a noun, the Romans preferred not to apply third declension I stem rules. Amans does not fit the qualifications for I stem nouns, and they would write or say amante with an E, especially when the participle takes a direct object and conveys a strong sense of the person doing whatever. But when it operated as a true adjective and had a noun to modify, they did use I stem rules, creating the variant amanti with an I in the ablative singular, and using ium in the genitive plural, amantium, and ia in the neuter nominative and accusative plural, amantia. Returning to participles and their declensions, where the present active participle is third, all the other participles are first-second, a distinction that still exists in the forms some Romance languages like Italian inherited from Latin participles. Now let's look at an example of a Latin verb and its participles, using a third conjugation verb because they're always the most difficult, ago. Taking the participle signs cited above, remember them? I hope so. And adding them to the base and proper thematic vowel for third conjugation, E, you get the present active participle of ago, agens, agentis. From the vocabulary, you know the perfect passive participle of ago. It's the fourth principal part, actus You just have to memorize that one. Inserting UR into that creates the future active participle octurus a And returning to the present base, add nd, and you have the future passive participle, agendus a Many Latin participles enter English as derivatives. Some students find it easier to learn these forms when they realize they already know them. For instance, our word agent, which comes from the present participle of this verb, agens agentis. The perfect passive participle actus produced act and action in English. And the future passive participle, agendus, underlies our word agenda. Only the future active participle acturus has generated no derivatives, unless you count acture age. That raises the question of what these forms mean and how to translate them, which at heart is not at all a difficult process. Each of the Latin participles has a simple, if not always idiomatic, English equivalent, which in most instances is enough to render a passable, if not always elegant, English translation. Amans amantis, for example, means literally loving. Remember that Latin nt plus third declension endings equals English ing. As we've already learned, amatus a means having been loved. Never an ingredient in a silky smooth English translation, but having been whatevered will rarely lead you astray. The same goes for turning amaturus a into about or going to love, the English periphrastic construction which is required, remember that, in the absence of willing love. And finally, the hardest of all participles to transform into simple English, the future passive, about or going to be loved, which is how we'll render it for now. The next chapter will discuss one of its major uses. Before leaving the formation of regular participles, let's address their expectation. It's exactly what you'd expect. The active ones, amans and amaturus, call for direct objects, loving or going to love someone. And the passive ones, amatus, amandus, call for agents, having been or going to be loved by someone. Finally, the verb to be in Latin, sum esse, has only one participle, the future active, futurus a probably one of the easiest forms to remember in Latin. Future, futurus. Naturally, sum has no passive forms, being, beed, but quite unexpectedly, it also has no present active participle, the equivalent of English being. The lack of this basic participle forced Latin into some odd expressions, as we'll see later in the course. Actually, there was a participle that meant being in pre-classical Latin, sans santis, but it survived into the classical age only in a compounded, vowel-gradated form. For example, in absens absentis, absent, that is, being away, and in praesens praesentis, present, that is, being right in front or standing before. Now let's address the use of participles in Latin, which happens considerably more often than in English. Simply put, the Romans used their participles a lot more than we do, both as adjectives and substantives, which is to be expected when an adjective's form naturally indicates number and gender. So, decanes, the present active participle of deco, can mean not only the one speaking, but the speaker. Likewise, intelligentes can mean both those comprehending and smart people, and moventia, literally moving things, things that motivate action, also means motivations. Where Latin tends to use participial phrases, English prefers whole clauses. For instance, those beginning with when, if, although, since, who, which, and so on. To wit, where Latin will have the students ignoring their teacher suffered horribly, English prefers the students who ignored their teacher suffered horribly. Or where Latin says the forms, having been ignored by the students, came back to haunt them, English will say the forms which had been ignored by the students came back to haunt them. The result is a rich array of possibilities for translating Latin participles into English. So, for instance, the Latin sentence, "Seeing the errors of their ways, those wretched students begged for mercy," can be turned into English as, "Since they saw the errors of their ways, when or after they saw, those students who saw, those students, if they saw," or, if we invert the sense entirely, although they saw the errors of their ways, those wretched students did not beg for mercy. These translations raise another important issue concerning Latin participles, one we'll deal with several times in this class, the concept of relative time. Returning to the same sentence we were just using, "seeing the errors of their ways, blah, blah, blah," which can be rendered in English with a clause like, "since they saw," note that the present tense participle seeing is represented by the past tense finite verb saw in the clause. That's not a mistake, nor even really a change of tense, because present participles are not necessarily always happening in present time. Present is a misleading and badly chosen name. Present participles should be called contemporaneous participles because they represent the same time as the main verb. To put it another way, their time value is +0, which will be present tense if the main verb is present tense. For instance, he is happy now, seeing you there. That is, he's seeing you right at this moment, and because of that, he's happy now. Both the main verb and the participle are present tense. But make the main verb past, and it drags the participle into the past. He was happy yesterday, seeing you there. In other words, he saw you in the past, and that made him happy back then. Now, who knows, maybe he's miserable. So in this sentence, the seeing and the was happy are both events that took place in the past, meaning a so-called present participle denotes in this context a past tense action. The same principle holds true for the purported perfect participles. Having shows prior action, that is, action which took place prior to the time of the main verb. Its time value is -1, and as long as the main verb is present tense, then the participle represents action that took place one step back in the past. For example, he is happy now, that is, in the present, having seen you there yesterday in the past. The main verb is +0, the participle is -1, so the participle's action is actually taking place one step back in time from the present, -1. But make the main verb past tense, and the participle's real-time value changes to the pluperfect, because now it's showing action prior to the past. That is, a -1 participle relative to a -1 main verb becomes -2 in real time. For example, he was happy yesterday having seen you the day before. In other words, he was happy after he had seen you. To put it another way, a past tense main verb pushes the real or absolute time value of any participle back one step in time. And that's because participles show relative, not absolute time. That is, time relative to the main verb. Future tense main verbs do the same, except they move the participle's real-time value forward in time. The result is that the so-called future participles, the ones that mean about or going to, show subsequent action. That is, they have a +1 time value. But this participle doesn't cause the same problems the perfect participle does. With future participles, the tense of the main verb doesn't matter, since in the periphrastic construction is going to, the form is changed, not the future participle, which will always stay going to as long as you translate it that way, which you can. So make your life easy and do that. Thus, the future participle, in its periphrastic construction, the one that uses to be, acts the same way present participles do, meaning there's nothing new to learn here. Going back to our example, the going to see doesn't change. Whether you say, he is happy, going to see you, meaning he is going to see you, or he was happy, he was going to see you. Only the is or was changes along with the main verb. Ugh, that's complicated. We'll go over the concept of relative time several times, so if you didn't get it right here, no fear. We'll attack it again, and again, and again. The key point to understand is that the terminology for naming participles is misleading. If I were king of the universe, it's one of the first things I'd change. Present participles should be called contemporaneous. They have a +0 relative time value, which means they don't always show action that's happening now the way present tense finite verbs do. They show action that's happening at the same time as the main verb, that is, contemporaneously. Likewise, perfect participles have prior time value, -1, but that doesn't mean they're always perfect. Sometimes they're pluperfect, if the main verb is past tense. Finally, future participles show subsequent action, and because of the way they're used, that annoying periphrastic business, they follow the same rules as present participles. An important thing to remember here is that English and Latin participles operate the same way. They both show relative time. So as long as you can translate a Latin participle with an English one, and for the most part in this chapter you'll be able to do that, there's no need to address the issues pertaining to relative time. Problems arise only when converting a participle or the like into a clause, that is, changing a form which shows relative time to one which shows absolute time. And while that's not absolutely necessary here, it's a good investment in your Latin future to start wrapping your mind around how to make this sort of tense shift correctly. So let's practice making that change. Take the following sentence, which contains a participle, seeing you, he always smiles, and convert the participial phrase, seeing you, into a subordinate clause starting with when, without changing the meaning of the sentence or the time values of the verbs. How would you say it? Well, since both the main verb smiles and the participle seeing are present tense, there's no relative versus absolute time issue here. When he sees you, he always smiles. But what if the main verb were past tense? Seeing you, he always smiled. What's the correct when clause equivalent for the participle now? That's right. When he saw you, he always smiled. The participle seeing has a time value of +0, and the main verb smiled a time value of -1, making the true or absolute time of the participle -1. So in a when clause, which requires a finite verb, it has to be saw. Now what if the participle is perfect, but the main verb is present? Having seen you, he always smiles. Turn the participial phrase, having seen you, into a when clause. Good. When or whenever he has seen you, he always smiles or is smiling. The participle having seen is -1, which, when combined with smiles +0, equals -1, has seen. So what if both the participle and the main verb are past tense? Having seen you, he always smiled. Think about it for a second. When did he do the seeing relative to the smiling? Did the seeing come before the smiling? Yes. So, what tense should the verb be in a when clause that's equivalent to this participle? Good. Pluperfect. When or whenever he had seen you, he always smiled, or was always smiling. Having seen -1 plus was smiling -1 equals had seen -2. Future tense main verbs operate the same way with participles that present tense main verbs do. For instance, with a present participle, seeing you, he will always smile, is the equivalent of whenever he will see you, he will always smile. 0 plus 1 equals +1. Or with the past tense participle, having seen you, he will always smile, equals whenever he has seen you, he will always smile or be smiling. -1 plus 1 equals +1/2 in Latin grammar math. Future participles with any tense of main verb create no issues and can be translated literally. For instance, whenever he is or was about to see you, he is or was always smiling. Unlike when a perfect participle is attached to a past tense main verb and becomes pluperfect in absolute time, future plus future causes no problems. Whenever he is going to see you, he will always be smiling. In other words, there is no future. Thank goodness. In the end, when the main verb is either present or future tense, you don't have to worry about changing the relative tense of the participle if you convert it into a clause with a finite verb that shows absolute time, because present and future tense main verbs don't change the basic time frame of a sentence. Participles stay in their proper tense and don't change time value. But past tense main verbs do cause problems in moving between relative and absolute time. Their -1 time value shifts everything back one step into the past. With a past tense main verb, present participles happen in the past, -1. Perfect participles happen in the pluperfect, -2. One more time. Let's practice shifting verb forms between relative and absolute time. If you've mastered this change, you can skip ahead in this presentation to the vocabulary. Let's start with this sentence. Students, studying hard or when studying hard, invariably do well on their tests. Let's convert the relative time participial phrase, studying hard, into a when clause with a finite absolute time verb. Look at the time value of the participle. It's +0 because studying is a present participle. The main verb is present too. So in this case, there's no need to change the tense of the participle when converting it into a finite verb. When students study hard, they invariably do well on their tests. Next sentence. Finding the enemy, the soldier went running to the general. Make finding the enemy a when clause. Here the main verb is taking place in the past, so the participle will have to change tense and become past too. When he found the enemy, the soldier went running to the general. Here's another sentence with a participle. Having been betrayed by them, he will never again trust the Greeks. Turn the participial phrase, having been betrayed by them, into a since clause, and be careful not to change the voice, please. Ask yourself, future tense main verb plus perfect participle equals what time value? That's right, past -1. Since he was betrayed by them, he will never again trust the Greeks. And one more sentence. Having been betrayed by them, he never again trusted the Greeks. Now we have a past tense main verb with a perfect participle attached. -1 plus -1 equals -2. Pluperfect. Since he had been betrayed by them, he never again trusted the Greeks. As we noted before, we'll always translate Latin participles with English participles for the moment. Why? Because we can. But that won't always be true, as we'll soon see. So you're eventually going to have to learn how to jump quickly and correctly between relative and absolute time verb forms. If you can master this now, you'll make your life much easier in the future. Now let's look at the vocabulary in this chapter. The first word is aliquis, aliquid, meaning someone, somebody, something, a pronoun. It's a combination of the base ali, meaning some or other, and the interrogative pronoun quis, meaning who. Adding the first part ali changes the pronoun from interrogative to indefinite, from who to someone, literally other who. What would be the genitive singular of this pronoun? That's right, alicuius. Remember that cuius is the genitive singular of quis. And the dative singular? Good for you, alicui. Please make a note, too, that the neuter nominative and accusative plural is aliqua, not aliqui, because the plural uses the interrogative adjective, not pronoun. The next word is jucundus meaning pleasant, delightful, agreeable, or pleasing. It's a first, second declension adjective. Ugh, that evil Mr. Wheelock. What a word to choose for this vocabulary list. While jucundus looks like a future passive participle because it ends ndus, it's not. It's just an adjective, though the nd affix inside jucundus points to the linguistic origin of the future passive participle, a form unique to Latin. This nd affix originally created adjectives, as it does in jucundus. It didn't carry any tense or voice value. But the Romans at some point decided to assign it a future passive value, and thus used it to create their future passive participle. Note also, please, that jucundus expects a dative after it, that is, pleasing to someone. This is called a dative with jucundus or with a special adjective. The next word is another adjective, liber, libera, liberum, meaning free, its first, second declension. And notice that it does not contract. The base is liber. The next word is umquam, meaning ever, an adverb. As we've noted before, it's the correlative of numquam, never. Next is audio, audiri, audivi, auditum, meaning hear or listen to. It's a fourth conjugation verb. Be careful not to confuse this verb with audeo, audere, which means dare. The hear verb is fourth conjugation, the dare verb is second. The next word is another verb, cupio, cupere, cupivi, cupitum, meaning desire, wish, or long for. It belongs to the third io conjugation. This verb expects a complementary infinitive, desire to do something. And here's another verb, ostendo, ostendere, ostendi, ostentum, meaning exhibit, show, display. Its third conjugation. It's a compound of the prefix ob or obs, meaning out toward, plus the verb tendo, which means stretch. If you stretch something out toward someone, you're showing or displaying it. Thus, this verb takes both an accusative direct object, something, and a dative indirect object, someone or to someone. Another thing to note about this verb is that the present and perfect bases are the same, which in certain forms can cause confusion. To wit, translate ostendit. It's either he displays, or he displayed, or has displayed. The same holds true for ostendimus, we display, or we displayed, have displayed. Now translate, please, ostendi. If you take the ostend base here as perfect, it means I showed, I have shown. But if you interpret it as the present base, ostendi translates as to be shown, the present passive infinitive. And next comes another verb, peto petere petivi petitum, meaning seek, aim at, beg, or beseech, also third conjugation. But note that the third principal part, petivi, is formed as if this verb were fourth, not third. Its sense anticipates both an accusative direct object and a prepositional phrase, ab, ex, or de plus the ablative. You seek something, accusative direct object, from someone, prepositional phrase. How would Latin say, they are seeking? That's just the present active third person plural. So what's the thematic vowel used in that form in third conjugation? That's right. You, petunt. Now, take the R out of the English. How would Latin say they seeking? That's the present active participle, isn't it? What we just studied in this chapter. What's the marker for the present active participle in Latin? In other words, English ing equals what in Latin? Yes, nt plus third declension endings. And they connotes nominative plural, let's assume masculine, which means the correct ending is ace. And this verb is third conjugation. What's the proper thematic vowel? We just studied this. Correct. The letter E. So how does Latin say they seeking? Petentes. This could also be translated as a substantive, meaning the seekers. And here's yet another third conjugation verb. Premo, premere, pressi, pressum, meaning press or press hard. Note how in the perfect base, the M at the end of the present base prem changes to S when it runs into the SI perfect affix, producing the perfect base press with two S's. The next word, opprimo, opprimere, oppressi, oppressum, is a compound of premo, meaning suppress, overwhelm, overpower, or check. Like premo, it's a third conjugation verb. The ob prefix in opprimo has a somewhat different sense from the way it's used in ostendo. Here it means up against, that is, press up against. And note the vowel gradation in which the slightly more colorful premo becomes the totally lackluster opprimo. How would Latin say, you will suppress? What conjugation is this verb? That's right, third. And how does third conjugation form its future? Good. With E. So the answer is opprimes. And here comes another verb in this verbal parade. No surprise, I suppose, in a chapter about participles. Verto, vertere, verti, versum means turn or change. Yet one more third conjugation verb. Like ostendo too, its base is the same in the present and the perfect, meaning it's sometimes hard to tell what tense it is. For instance, vertit. How is this verb translated? Either he changes or he changed, has changed. Early Latin distinguished these forms by reduplicating the perfect, veverti, but the reduplication was lost by the classical age. The wert base shows up in English as the suffix ward, as in toward or homeward, meaning literally turned to or turned in the direction of home. The last verb in the vocabulary list is averto, avertere, averti, aversum, meaning turn away or avert. It's a third conjugation verb. Memorizing this verb should be no problem. It's a combination of a or ab, meaning away or away from, and verto, meaning turn. The final three items in this vocabulary are all nouns. The first is donum doni, neuter, meaning gift or present. Its second declension, neuter. It uses the same base as the verb do, dare, to which has been added and N affix and second declension endings. The N affix is used in Latin to form nouns and adjectives. It means the result of, and can also be seen in magnus, great, literally the result of N being more, mag, or regnum, kingdom, literally the result of N, ruling, reg. What's the accusative plural of donum? Yes, dona. The next to last word is orator, oratoris, masculine, meaning orator or speaker. It's a third declension masculine noun. Remember that any Latin noun which goes or oris is third declension masculine. Literally, it means beggar or pleader. It shares a base with the verb oro, first conjugation, beg or plead. What's the genitive plural of orator? Good for you. Oratorum. It's third declension, but it's not I stem. The last word is signum, signi, neuter, meaning sign, signal, indication, seal. It's a second declension neuter noun. In Roman texts, it often refers to a legionary standard, a piece of military equipment used to keep soldiers in their proper formation before and during battle. Thus, for a Roman army to raise its standards meant it was lining up into maniples, cohorts, and legions in preparation for battle. Wow, that was quite a chapter, wasn't it? Know this. Chapter 23 is one of the longest and most difficult lessons in Wheelock. As the class proceeds, we'll review over and over the concepts and forms introduced here. But for the moment, do the rules that were cited at the beginning of this chapter now cast some vague shadow of sense over you? If not, please review this presentation. If so, please proceed to the next slide. For the next class meeting, please bring in a copy of the worksheet for Chapter 23. Here's a link to that worksheet. Studete valleteque o discipuli cari.